Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second event of the day for the Festival of Trusteeship. This is our final day. And today we're talking about our Charities Heterosexist. And before I pass over to Kevin, who's going to chair our panel, a few bits of housekeeping from me. So as you've seen, the session is being recorded. If you've booked onto this as an individual event, you'll get the recording afterwards. If you're a weekly pass holder, you'll get all of the recordings together later today. You've been muted on the way into the call. Please stay muted unless Kevin comes to you for a question. That just helps keep the sound nice and clear. We've enabled the subtitles at our end, so if you want to enable them at your end, you need to find your closed caption button. Please use the chat to ask questions, to share reflections. Please keep your comments respectful. Please also feel free, if the chat gets very busy, feel free to completely ignore it. It is on the recording, so you can return to it at a later time if you'd like to. We don't have any more networking sessions this week. We're finished with those. And then a couple of thank yous. So a big thank you to our media partner, Third Sector, who has helped us shout about this festival. And then a giant thank you to our sponsors, Ecclesiastical. Their support has allowed us to keep sessions like this completely free of charge. And the maximum anybody has paid to attend the festival is £5 a session. So we're really very, very grateful to Ecclesiastical. So on that note, I'm going to pass over to Kevin.
Thank you, Penny. Good afternoon, everyone. And just following on with regards to the housekeeping, clearly because of the nature of the conversation that we're having, which is around LGBTQIA plus identities, there's a lot of language there that might be new to people. So if you've got any questions around that, please do ask in the chat. But also we'd ask everybody to be as respectful as possible in recognizing that there are a lot of people with different characteristics on the call, and please just be mindful of that when writing anything or saying anything as part of the conversation today. So good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for the discussion where we'll be talking about heterosexism in charity governance and the impact that this has on charities. And we'll unpack this a little bit more with the help of our amazing panel. And before I go further, for the sake of the discussion, I want to also broaden this conversation out to talk about cis-sexism as well. So I'm just going to drop a definition of heterosexism into the chat for people if they're not familiar with the term, and then a definition of cis-sexism as well. When I just find the chat, here we go. So, and hi Charlotte, nice to see you. So that's a quick definition of heterosexism, which is a way of thinking in which only heterosexuality is seen as the norm, which results in discrimination against people from other sexual orientations. And in terms of cis-sexism, another link for you. Okay. So we also may use the term queer today, which is an umbrella term to describe everybody in the LGBTQIA plus community, and often is used as shorthand instead of the acronym. My name is Kevin. I founded the Charities So Straight campaign 3 years ago now, I think it is. And as part of that, we delivered a Queer Trustees project, which is all around advocating for greater LGBTQIA plus representation on charity boards. So we know that the charity sector supports a diverse range of people and causes, but this diversity isn't always necessarily reflected in its personnel, certainly at a senior level and also at board level. So we also know that the evidence base around minoritized community representation on boards also has major gaps, with no comprehensive data on LGBTQIA plus representation, and only 1 or 2 examples which have small localized sample data. So that's another problem that we'll come on to discuss. I'm delighted to be joined today by an excellent panel who bring a wealth of experience and a wealth of perspectives to the conversation, and who also have lived experience of marginalization. And I'd like to ask each of them to do a quick introduction and perhaps say something about your experience of serving as a trustee or working with trustees. I'm going to go alphabetically, so just testing me very quickly. That would be Amsel, I think, going first.
Thanks, Kevin. So yeah, hi, my name's Amsel Page-Von-Spreckelsen. I am a I work within the charity sector, and then I kind of volunteer within the charity sector. So I do an awful lot, like I find myself very much in that space a lot, working with boards as a so I work as an accountant, so I'm working with boards as a freelancer, and also I'm on the board. I'm on 2 boards at the moment, and over my career I've been on a couple of other different boards, so that's kind of my potted history.
And that would be Aaron next. Thank you, Amsel.
Thanks, Kevin. And then good shout on the alphabetical order. I'll be too nervous to be getting things right at this point. So, hi everyone. So my name's Aaron Verma. I'm currently head of inclusion at the University of London, and I'm also a trustee for Getting on Board. And that's my first ever board role. My brief journey, and we'll probably kind of come to this during the conversation. I feel like I kind of hit a gold mine getting to be a trustee for an organization that is about diversifying trusteeship. So it's kind of a bit of a full circle bit. So as my first appointment, it's been really, really empowering to be part of that, and really kind of, I feel like I've learned so much, and also been able to contribute at the same time in some way, shape or form. But I think I won't negate the fact that my perspectives before joining and Getting on Board, and this is just across the charity sector, that there wasn't a space or place for people like me that were, as a gay man of colour on boards, and I didn't necessarily see that representation. So in some ways, it's nice to be breaking down some barriers for that to happen, but also to be a part of this conversation to see if we can come up with some solutions and solve the charity sector issue itself today. So yeah.
That would be nice, wouldn't it, Aaron? John, I think you're up next.
Hi everyone, my name is John Cornejo. My pronouns are they, them, or he, him, and I am part of the Charities of White campaign. I'm also a consultant on anti-racism and anti-oppression, so I've had quite a few of these conversations with clients across the charity sector. My own history when it comes to the boards on charities, I have spent a very long time applying, never really getting through, and kind of gave up at some point. But I am on the board for Mobilization Lab, which is a really interesting and very different setup, where we are a flat structured collective doing training on campaignings, and so we're all facilitators, we're all sort of part of leadership, we're all part of the board. And it's been quite interesting just taking a very different approach to it, and seeing the kind of pitfalls as well of trying to still replicate the very sort of normative model of what a charity trustee is. So yeah, I'm here to talk from that perspective about what it's like to be a queer person of colour that's sort of knocking on the doors and never quite getting through.
Thank you, John, for sharing that perspective so openly with us. I think it's really a valuable one, and I think it's something that as queer people, we see it reflected both in terms of employability, but also in terms of boards. Nancy, by no means least, but last, unfortunately.
I'm so relieved that we've proved that queer people can get the alphabet in the right order, because I would not have been confident in my own ability there.
I've written it down as we were speaking.
Good. Love to hear that. So my name's Nancy, my pronouns are she and her. I guess relevant to the conversation later, I'm a lesbian. I'm also from a working class background. I recently acquired a long-term health condition, so I'm thinking about whether or not I'm disabled. So yeah, I think it's kind of picking up some of the points that Aaron and John and Amsel were all pointing at. I think, and hopefully we'll discuss this. A lot of marginalised people, when they approach a board, hold a lot of marginalised identities. So it's often not a simple thing. I've worked in the charity sector for pretty much all of my career. Including most recently as chief exec of Stonewall. So I've worked with boards a lot, and I've worked with boards a lot as an exec, and I've watched boards recruit in this strange powerless position you're in when you're an exec and you're not allowed to involve yourself, and you watch your board make decisions about who they feel will fit with them. But I've also sat on a couple of charity boards, and I've sat on a couple of kind of government advisory boards as well. So that's me, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Nancy. Great that you are here. Thank you. So let's move very quickly on to our first question, because we do have a lot of questions. So we've touched on this in the intros a little bit, but what is your experience of heterosexism on charity boards, and how do you think that this impacts on charities and their work? Who would like to take that first?
I'm happy to start.
Thank you.
I'll probably approach it from a culture perspective. So one of the things I think is something that we need to kind of acknowledge, and I think kind of re-acknowledge in a lot of ways, is that boards are premised and structured around heteronormativity. So that's the kind of the default in some ways, right? When we're looking at the way in which board cultures are represented, the kind of water cooler interactions around board meetings and that kind of stuff as well. So when you're coming in as a queer person into a space that is not necessarily, you come in as an outsider into that culture, and then you have to kind of find sometimes a quiet way to navigate it and try to assimilate if that's what you want to do as well in some ways. Or you can go in and try and challenge the culture, but that can also be quite difficult. And lots of authors have talked about, for example, like Sarah Ahmed in her book Complaint, talks about the notion of when you are the person complaining about the culture not being right or not being very inclusive in the space, you become the complaint itself, right? So I think there's a cultural aspect which I kind of want to touch on, and I think that's one of the things which can really shape the ways in which we recruit, the kind of welcome we have for trustees from across the queer spectrum and across queer identities more broadly as well. And it can also change the way in which board dynamics happen in meetings, not necessarily around running through the agenda, but it could also be when you're going to grab a warm drink during a break, or you're having a little breakout and just kind of a chat with people. That notion of actually everyone else is in maybe kind of heteronormative marriages or relationships, certain kind of quite kind of majoritized family structures in some ways, can mean that you and your life doesn't necessarily fit into some of those dynamics as well. So you have to kind of find a way to kind of navigate, challenge, and then also contribute your perspective in some ways. And that's quite a lot of cultural tax in itself. And it's quite a big burden, I think, even as a queer person of color, coming into that thinking, okay, well, I need to carry the role that I want to, professionally speaking, but I've also got a personal weight, which I need to also try and think about as well. So I just kind of wanted to kind of tackle the culture bit in relation to that question, because I think that does really have a domino effect on the ways in which practices then emerge in some ways. But yeah.
And that's interesting, isn't it, to explore the link between the heteronormativity, as you say, and then how that filters through into priorities for the charity and the programs and how that's developed and what the end result will be. And really interesting to consider how can we have equity within the space of a board when we carry a marginalized identity with us. And I think, John, when we spoke about this previously, we talked about how we have to change to fit into a mold and change to fit in with the existing status quo. Do you want to come in to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about a lot. I mean, in my work, that whole dynamic comes into any conversation I have on anti-oppression, but I have lately been sort of coming to the realization that I'm probably autistic, and sort of thinking about this from the perspective of masking and all the different changes and behaviors and things you adopt to try and fit into a space. And I've reflected on like how long it took me in coming into my first job in the charity office and kind of navigating the space, the various different kind of expectations that people had on you and sort of trying to fit in as much as possible. And I think any sort of interactions I've had with the board, it's been quite similar, where it feels like this entirely different world. The ways that people have conversations, the kind of backgrounds they have, the life experiences that they share, it can very quickly feel like you're very much an outsider, and you're trying to find different ways that, like, how do I need to talk to be taken seriously? What sort of interest should I have? Even when it comes to a decision-making perspective, it plays a huge role, because the ways that conversations happening in a board around key decisions, there will be expectations in terms of what kind of tone you should take in terms of critiquing, whether you should raise your voice when your position maybe is very different to the rest of the people around you. There have been plenty of times across my career where I have gone down a different path as a campaigner, because I felt this is what people expect of me, and this is what is expected as a good campaign, even though I don't think in that way. And I think that plays out in board level as well. So it's just, how do we deconstruct that space and make it one where we can really bring our full selves into the picture, rather than just bringing diversity in, but expecting everyone to fit the same mold, essentially.
It's a really good point. Nancy, Amsel, did you want to come in and comment on any of those thoughts and build on that?
I was just going to maybe build on what Aaron and John just said, if that's okay, and give a kind of real example. So one of the charities that I had the privilege to be a trustee of for many years, it's called All We Can, used to be called the Methodist Relief and Development Fund, and they'd recruited me to diversify their board. I am not actually because of my being a lesbian, but because of my being an atheist. But I am also obviously a lesbian, and the process of, and it was both a very difficult and a profoundly rewarding and learning experience for me. It's an amazing organisation. It's an organisation that, while I was sitting on the board, went through a kind of profound process of reflection in the board, and ended up reaffirming its commitment to a kind of evangelical model of working, right? So imagine being me, sitting on a board, everybody else is a Christian, most people are ministers, quite a lot of them are from evangelical faiths that have like really strong views about my existence, my lifestyle, whatever you call it. And we're all trying our best, and we did manage, all of us, to have really difficult conversations about the direction of an organisation. And the reason I sort of give that as a practical example is that the level, the sort of slice of me that was acceptable, the piece that Aaron was talking about and John was talking about, like, what bit of me can I show you that you can not just accept, but also relate to? It's not just about discrimination, it's about connection, right? How can I give you a slice of me that you can connect to? Was tiny. And I felt, and I sat with, because of my identity, just extraordinary amounts of discomfort in order to stay in that space. And I used to think a lot while I was there about how many people who shared my characteristics and my perspectives and my beliefs would have been able to stay sitting with that amount of discomfort. And that wasn't the intention of my colleague board members. But it was just a fact about the culture and the dominant ideas and ideologies of that board, and kind of structural disadvantage within society. So kind of just really endorsing and echoing everything that John and Aaron said, and wanting to kind of illustrate it in a real world board experience.
And I think it takes a lot of resilience, doesn't it, to remain in that space, and I think as queer people we have to develop good resilience anyway to put ourselves in these situations and face rejection. And it's really interesting your point, and I know we touched on this when we spoke previously, which is around what kind of queer person is acceptable to be on a board. Who are we allowed to be within this space, and can we be ourselves, or do we have to put on a disguise and be something or somebody else? Amsel, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I think that there's two elements of what we've been talking about that I think are really sort of interesting to look at. One is to sort of almost bring it back to the original question, you know, what's the effect? And I think the effect is it's a huge amount of extra work that's being done by I mean, queer people, but just generally minoritized people. When you have a majority group, you know, when you have a board or whatever, that is a majority group. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about sort of heteronormativity. You know, it's a normative focus. It turns that group into, if you are like this, it's very easy to fit in. So you don't see how much work other people are doing. And, you know, and then Nancy's talking about the sheer, you know, it shouldn't have to be that way, that only the sort of person who is, and I'm gonna, you know, Nancy's got a huge amount of experience at how charities work, which I think if you didn't have, sitting in that space with that set of thing, you know, would be hugely difficult. And, you know, on a personal reflection, I often think about this. So I've got that sort of odd working class background where I come from a very, I come from working class background, but I went to a public school on an assisted play scheme. So I can code switch quite easily. And as like over the last couple of years, I've been really looking at that ability and what that means, which is that I can go into a board and talk like they talk. And I'd almost been hiding it from myself that was what I was doing, you know, because I'm like, I'm just me. I'm just turning up. I'm just doing this sort of thing. But actually, it's a skill set that you know, I have and certain people have. And I think when we create normative spaces that you know, and this is what it does to queer people as well, you know, I think, and as someone said, like, you end up with so many different minoritizations. Once you've got one minoritization, you end up finding all of these other different ways, you know, that and how they intersect. Like, I think, yeah, if you've got that skill set, you can sort of position yourself into a place and come into a place, but then you almost become, it's easy to become the sort of pet or the sort of acceptable face of queerness or whatever. I know that, you know, like, I'm white, I sound middle class. I know what those people like to talk about because I went to school with them. So you know, when Aaron was talking about those water cooler moments, not necessarily knowing how to talk to people, like, that's what normativity does, is it shuts out the people who haven't necessarily got those experiences, and it forces those people who, you know, who have, you know, looking at me and Nancy, the two white people on the panel, you know, we fit in, but we have to mask, we have to hide parts of ourselves, or we have to sit with incredible amounts of discomfort. And I feel like that's what it does, you know, that's what the heterosexism does to us as queer people. It's like, you know, for the people on who it serves, they don't notice it, but for us, we're either shut out or being someone that isn't necessarily entirely who we are.
Yeah, agreed. And I think for that reason, and this feeds really nicely into our next question, which is for many people, many queer people only feel comfortable applying to become a board member in an LGBTQ charity. So is this because we are disenfranchised? Is it because we are self-excluding in order to stay safe? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
So I think for me, this is often the case within all minoritized backgrounds, where you are looking for a space where you fit in, a space where you can be yourself. And I can see, as a queer person, that going into a board where everyone else is of that background, it's, on the one side, it's that you know how the conversation flows. You don't need to do as much of that code switching. You will still likely need to do some, because we all have different intersecting identities. But it is easier to be ourselves, to not have to deal with the weight of heterosexism on top of us and those expectations. In the same way as you often, I get a very different feeling being in meetings with my fellow Charities of White activists, where we're all people of color, we've all had similar life experiences. But I think there is also another side of that, where if within an LGBTQ organization's board, you have an organization that is working broadly in the space of LGBTQ rights, that the communities that you're working with and for are the same as the ones that are hopefully taking decisions at board and director level. So there is that embedding of lived experience that makes it quite different from a traditional board in a way, where I know that that's another big challenge of how do you get more lived experience representation on boards. Where it is around minoritized communities, it's almost easier because you can sort of self-select around that particular sort of community without needing to change the overall structures and power dynamics in a massive way. So I think it does just impact the work the organization is able to do as well, because it's not just everyone else around the table is also queer, it's everyone else also has lived experience of the very issues that we are fighting for and working on.
Thank you, John. Aaron, I think you wanted to come in there as well, didn't you?
Yeah, sure. It's just kind of building on some of the points we've touched about. I just want to kind of do a very brief kind of 101 on intersectionality, because it's probably a word that I use and I've been practicing for about 10 years, and probably say about 25 times a day. But only so because I think it's really, really important, because I think this speaks to this question of why queer people might be more akin to going to apply for boards in queer organizations, right? So intersectionality, very briefly, developed by Black female scholar activists in the late 1980s, premised on the centering of Black women's experiences and marginalization in the context of structures being represented or not being represented, and then also on the political side as well. So if we take those three facets of intersectionality and look at, let's say, a traditional board makeup in some ways, the structures of a current board are not led with a queer lens in some way, shape, or form. The policies, the practices, the cultures are not kind of, really kind of bringing that to life in some way. Then there's an issue of representation. We don't see, maybe less so, queer people who represent a multitude of intersecting identities leading, or highly profile or public figures leading around this particular conversation, which is quite tricky as well. So there's a representation issue, and there's also a political aspect as well. So if we just look, for example, 13 years on from the Equality Act 2010, we've got a policy that protects the rights of LGBTQ plus people, so it says in the Equality Act, right? However, I know for a fact that I don't still feel safe holding my husband's hand in public. So you can have a really great policy and legislative framework, but if it's not well implemented, it ain't going to change anything. So I think that's just one example of that in some way, shape, or form. So if we look at queer organizations that have applied a queer lens to their structures, looked at queer representation from the outset, and also been kind of quite forthcoming in their defense, their rebuttal towards political pressure and the way they're positioned as an organization, then already you're creating a space that is a little bit more accessible to queer people. You can see that there's some sharedness there, there's some connectedness to the community. I'm not saying all queer organizations get it right in any way, shape, or form, and there's lots of queer organizations that fall down when it comes to tackling racism or ableism and so on and so forth. However, if we're just looking at that perspective, if you create a space from the outset with a group of people from a certain community, you're more likely to attract them because there's that connectedness there. And I think that's one of the ways into coming into boards. And I think that's where the kind of ease of it is in some respect as well. So I just wanted to kind of frame that around it as an intersectional issue, because I think it's really one way to look at it as well.
I think that's really important and super important that we consider intersectionality in all of the work that we do. And I know it's something that we always think about from a queer trustees perspective. Nancy, you wanted to come in?
I did, and kind of come back to the question of like what like that question of why we don't necessarily apply to be on boards. And I just want to give ourselves a shout out because we're not stupid and we know something about how board recruitments work, right? Again, just to be very, very cards on table, which is we'll tell you everything about what happens when I go through board recruitments. But boards recruit to themselves. Boards typically, or can, I'll be careful here, many boards can in fact have very different cultures from the culture of the charity they are the board of, particularly as regards diversity matters. That was my very careful talking bit. So when you think about putting yourself forward for a board position, and you feel maybe a bit of imposter syndrome, I know I do, despite what I think Amsel very, very kindly referred to my great experience, which I think just means I'm a bit old these days. But I feel like a bit weird going, I should come and be your governance. So we might feel those same things, or be more likely to feel those things, particularly if you hold multiple marginalised identities. And we know that the likelihood is we're putting ourselves into a pool, we're applying to be part of the club, and the club members are deciding whether we can join. And we know that lots of the time that club has a culture and has a membership that we're quite different from, and that's all quite scary. You know, and we look on the bios of the people who are already in that board club, and maybe they don't seem like us in all sorts of ways. So I think there were kind of pull factors to kind of to applying for boards that reflect our identity or our identities, whatever they are. But then there are also like push factors that make it feel like quite a leap to ask to be part of a board that is not really explicit about its commitment to kind of genuinely challenging itself around diversity and inclusion.
Thank you. Amsel, did you want to come in at all on that point?
Yeah, I think again it really does come down to the extra work that you have to do, and you know, whether you want to go in and create that space or whether you want to go to somewhere which has already done that work. So what I thought was interesting, when a note that I wrote whilst Aaron was talking, so and about, you know, that idea of like queer charities having queer spaces and having that kind of almost inbuilt and by design. What I've noticed, so I work with as a freelancer, I find myself working across the board with, like, I work with charities that are established and have been around for, you know, like hundreds of years, and working with charities that we are building in the moment. And it is changing. There is a sense that the charities that are being built at the moment can build their boards in such a way that it works for the charity. And those are the ones where you're seeing diversity, where it's being created from the ground up with a sense of what can we do to make it work. And then the ones that are sort of still existing are in that position that Nancy's sort of talking about, where you have a charity operational kind of structure, operational team up to SLT that are doing all of the work, and then the board's just somewhere else, and they're just not engaging. And I think that, again, that's that normativity. It's that easiness, you know, it's that ease of it. Just, well, we're just like this, and people tell themselves the story that, you know, that the reason why they don't need to change is because everything's fine, because they're looking at other people in the room who all look like them and talk like them and think like them, and they're all saying, we don't need to change, everything's fine, because they're not letting the people who are there, who would say, you know what, you need to change, into the room in the first place.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at the chat as well, Ansel, and I wonder if you've got any thoughts on this particular point, which is around visibility that we have as queer people and the visible differences that we bring. Some of us, not me, I'm a white cisgendered queer man of a certain age, so there are people in this room who have different intersectionalities than I do. So thinking about visibility and the some of the visible differences that we bring, and I know it's certainly a conversation that I've had with some trans and gender diverse people recently, which is around, do I want to be openly trans if I pass as trans in my trans identity? Do I want to out myself as being trans? And that's a question that everybody has to go through and reach their own conclusions with. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. Because what I think is one of the funniest things about that is the first charity I was on the first charity I was on the board of was a queer charity. So it's Brighton's LGBT Switchboard, which is currently going from strength to strength, which is really exciting. And I joined that board and I was in the closet and it was pre-transition and I was there going, yeah, I'm just your straight cis ally on the board. And we're sitting around, they're going, we need more bi people and we need more trans people. And I'm sitting there in my head going, yeah, we do, don't we? Yeah, it'd be great if someone like that was on the board. But I couldn't tell them. And I thought that was fascinating because I'd already told them that because I wasn't out in my real, in either of those positions in my real life. I couldn't tell them, and I had to, after I resigned from that board, that then gave me the space to start doing that process of coming out. And so if you think about how difficult that was in a openly LGBT space where we're literally saying we need more people with this representation, how hard do you think it must be for people to do it when they're just getting along fine? They're not going to. If you pass, if you're a trans person who passes, and there's a lot of issues around that phrasing in this community, so what I want to kind of preface that with that, but if that's what you want to do and that's your goal and that's who you are, you have no one has a right to ask you, and you have no obligation to tell them your status. And yeah, why would you want to? Just so that they can tick a box to feel good about themselves. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it. You're muted, Kevin.
And I'm on mute. Yeah. Thanks, Amsel, for sharing that. And Nancy's made a point in the chat as well, which is around lots of queer organizations will have a certain type of queer person on their board. Nancy, do you want to expand on that?
Colloquially known as the A-gays.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, part of that is about how boards recruit, and that they recruit people that they feel comfortable with. And it's quite difficult to disrupt that. It's quite difficult to go, we are going to deliberately recruit people who we feel less comfortable with. That's a kind of counterintuitive piece. And part of it's also about the other kind of elephant in the room. Most charities want to recruit boards, at least to a degree, that can bring cash and connections. And so if you sort of smoosh those two factors together, that like any group, unless they make a conscious effort to, boards will recruit type. And sometimes that's dead obvious. And sometimes it's less obvious. It's all of those cultural indicators that Aaron was talking about right at the beginning. And that you're looking for rich people, or you're looking for people that are really well connected to rich and powerful people, because you think that that's going to give your charity more reach. Those things kind of smoosh together to mean that recruitment into those spaces. I mean, I think we talk, you're going to end up with actually quite heteronormative queers, basically. Yeah. I'm saying, and certainly very acceptable, powerful, you know, people that actually are ironically are the people that would find it easiest to be on the board of a big mainstream charity, actually, because they would fit right in. And you see less, you know, so the trans person will be absolutely the most socially acceptable, least challenging trans person, and the lesbian will be, you know, definitively married with 3.5 kids, and everybody's going to be white, and you know, nobody's got a disability, and so I just think that's important, because I think it's important in this conversation for us not to kind of pretend that LGBTQ plus organisations are absolutely brilliant at like board diversity, because they're not,
and they have their own problems. I completely agree. I completely agree, Nancy, and that's a really good point, well made. And I think that that point stands whether or not we're thinking about LGBTQ charities or whether we're thinking about non-LGBTQ charities. They want a certain type of person on their board who brings wealth and connections. And if you think about how queer people with and queer people with intersectionalities are multiply disadvantaged in society, then that all really comes into play, doesn't it? Because we might not be able to bring all of those things that the boards are looking for. So I think that's such an important point. If we think about overcoming this, then what actions can charities take to try and overcome reaching queer people and queer people with intersections? What can they do to overcome this? How can they remove barriers to recruit people like us and make their charity not only feel like, but actually be a safe place for us to be in? Who would like to go first on that question?
I'm happy to start, and then there's probably 101 things, right, to do, and I'm sure that and I'll probably just stick to 2 or 3. So the first thing is for boards to have honest conversations about the cultural composition and landscape of who is in the room. And also not just kind of thinking about flooding the gates with as much diversity as possible, but ensuring, is this board safe enough? I don't believe in safe spaces. I believe in saferness, you know, because I think that's a bit more realistic. So I think boards need to have that on their on kind of regular agendas or part of an annual review or whatever, to really think about, are we reflecting the culture of the community that we said and signed up to serve and help support to serve in some way, shape or form? So I think that's one part. And I think looking at culture as a board is a really constructively disruptive conversation to have. And I think it's really important. It's also it's very fun to have that conversation when you're on the brink of discomfort, but you're learning something new. And I think that's a really nice space to occupy in some way, shape or form. The second part, and I think is something that Nancy's mentioned as well, is just around recruitment. That nepotism is still rife in board recruitment. So I think one of the key things is thinking about, is our recruitment policies fully and really inclusive? Who have they been designed with? And how are we ensuring that people who are on panels or the kind of exercise and activities doing, are they actually showing that our board is safe enough for people from different marginalized groups to come on board as well in some way, shape or form? And then the third one, and I just want to kind of challenge the notion of the word reach, because I've seen it a lot in the charity sector more broadly, this notion of this kind of fallacy of like the hard to reach groups. Queer people are everywhere, so it's just about finding or kind of putting some resource into connecting with the community, having meaningful conversations with small community grassroots organizations, learning and engaging in that knowledge exchange, working together to figure out a way in which both can achieve success in some way, shape or form. I think when we see boards and even organizations reaching out, and I always go back to sort of the local grassroots organizations that are just trying to get a little bit of money just to get by. I think those are the ones we should be connecting with, because those are the groups that are closest to the people and the communities we're trying to connect with and engage more broadly as well. So I just want to say, queer people are everywhere. We're not scary. There's lots of us, and just kind of say hi and just come up with an open mindset and let's work together. Leela Watson, famous Indigenous Aborigines activist, said something along the lines of, I'm not doing this any justice, this quote, but essentially said, if you've come here to help me, don't waste my time. But if you've come because our liberation is bound together, let us work together to something like that. So I think that's the road we can take in some way, shape, or form. So yeah.
Thanks, Aaron. That's all really valuable stuff, and I agree with you. We're not hard to reach, and no, we're not scary. But actually, that brings me on to another question, and I will give other people the opportunity to come in on that question, which is around reaching us. But there's a lot of points around a reluctance to talk about queer, a reluctance to talk about LGBTQ people. We want to talk about diversity, but LGBTQ people are not part of that conversation, and I'm really interested in why we think that is, and completely agree with you around the point on reach. It's about, we're under prioritized. We are not part of the conversation. We're not part of people's thought process when it comes to diversifying, and some of that I think is around wanting to get quick and easy wins and wanting to recruit people who are visibly diverse. I'd like to open those points up to everybody to come in. Amzal, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just the thing you said where it's like LGBTQ people aren't included in that diversity thing, and the thing that came into my head was, you got gay marriage more now, what more do you want? Like, that sometimes feels like the approach to, you know, so whilst we're watching in terms of basically you've got the L and the G being like kind of promoted as having everything that they want because we can now marry same-sex partners, like that was the only thing that was actually, that was stopping us from existing and engaging in the world. And then the rest of the rest of it is like this kind of constant drumbeat to just push them back down in your box, get away, we don't like you. Yeah, what more do we want? We've got everything we needed, we asked for. And I think that can sometimes feel like the way that that kind of diversity type thing goes, and it goes into that sense of you can now bring your acceptable gays onto your board, and you've got your diversity quotient, brilliant. You can even bring your trans people who look and sound like me onto your boards, and I'm very aware that I am one of those. I'm aware of this because I get approached as people's diversity kind of panelist or whatever, because and it's like, nah, you need to find the people, you need to actually make it so that the people who haven't, who are being oppressed still can have that space, not people who have already got that space.
Thank you. Nancy, did you want to come in?
The two points briefly on the two different questions. I think people do still feel really uncomfortable talking about sexual orientation and gender identity. And I don't mean that in a technical way, because of course that's a slightly weird thing to talk about. I don't mean people feel uncomfortable kind of talking about what research says about, I don't know, the intersection of aging and changing sexual orientation or something. I just mean people feel really uncomfortable talking about people being gay or lesbian or bi or queer in any way or trans or non-binary. And that discomfort that needn't be malintentioned at all, actually. I think I mean it quite neutrally, can lead to situations where, I personally, I won't say I'm triggered by, but a warning sign for me is always if people don't have a form they don't ask. And if you're not asking me, what that tells me is your organisation is so uncomfortable around LGBTQ plus people and feels like it's somehow impolite to talk about us. That probably means it's not an entirely safe space for me. And so I think there's something about building kind of cultural competence about, talking about people being queer and people being trans is safe. and it's a way of making us safer. It's not rude, it's not impolite, it's not crossing a line. So I just wanted to kind of make that point. And then the other thing that I was going to do, which was kind of add on to Aaron's absolutely amazing list of things you should do to recruit more diverse boards. And I would just say that I think these things are applicable, and also actually what Amsa was just saying. I think these things are applicable to all desire to diversify boards, not just to LGBTQ plus recruitments. I think there's something important about how you talk about your organisation, how you talk about the people in your organisation, what you put in your recruitment materials, all of that stuff. But the two things I would really point to is, one is I really think it's helpful for boards not to recruit with only boards doing the recruitment. Like the non-co model of recruitment is bad. It is just bad for all diversity, and boards they don't have to recruit that way, and they should stop recruiting that way. It shouldn't only be boards recruiting onto boards. They should have people that work in the organisation, and they should have external advisors, and I think that would just make things work a lot better, and those people should have parity. And again, and I think this is true of diversity on boards generally, I think you've got to pay them. You know, if you really want to change who sits on boards, pay for their time. And again, that's not specific to LGBTQ plus people, but particularly if you think about taking on an officer role on a board or a chairing role, it is a massive commitment to do that well in time terms. The people who can afford to do that are a very particular subset of society often. So I think I would just add those two kind of suggestions to things that I know people have already said.
Thank you, Nancy. And I completely agree with your point around paying anybody from minority communities or anybody who's a lived experience trustee. I completely agree with that. And I know it's an ongoing conversation that getting on board have regularly. John, did you want to come in?
I haven't done that in such a long time. And just Nancy's point on recruitment sort of brings me back to the sort of really practical headspace. And I'll start just with a story from a job quite a while ago now. I was talking to the chair of the board, and this was at annual AGM, members all around, and there was sort of a conversation I was having with two board members around lack of diversity in the board. Everyone was white, everyone was retired, I think, for the most part, and the people that weren't were from the membership. Everyone was from a very specific background, and a lot of them knew each other, and they had been the challenge on them that they needed to diversify the board. But I remember this conversation so vividly with the chair of the board, because she said, we've tried everything we can. I've talked to all of my friends, all of my networks, and there's just no one out there that isn't like us. And it's like, you just told me you don't have any Black friends, that you don't have any queer friends, any disabled friends, like, and it's not like you just can't see it when you're in that space, when you're so sort of like, this is your world, like this isn't the norm, this is everyone around you is the same. And it is just a really practical thing. You need to go outside of your own networks, and that means the sort of trustee talking to their mates kind of route has to end. We have to sort of advertise in different places. We have to go proactively seeking the type of backgrounds and the type of experiences that we want. There's also another story as well, just in terms of like, how do you change the sort of overall space within a board? How do you change the overall culture? And that is something that I think you do need to think practically again around individual growth and learning as a person within the board, whether you're chair or just another member of the board or anyone else in this space. Just thinking about your own biases, how your biases have maybe shaped recruitment decisions in the past, and sort of different ways that you can pick up on your learning. Because we do often end up replicating the systems that are the norm in the world around us. This is something that's happening very sort of live conversation at the moment within Mobilization Lab, which is where I'm on the board for. We are a flat structure. And what I realized the other day when talking to someone else in the team is that the board meetings can be really weird in comparison to the staff meetings. So like there's a sort of certain normative culture that it feels like very much we're replicating the work of the charity sector. And what I didn't realize is like, I think something like maybe 80% of us are also queer. But it feels like the most heteronormative space I've been in, because we're trying to kind of, I don't know, legitimize ourselves as an organization and try and build up the sort of reputation that we had before. So we're just replicating that system, and it sort of goes over our heads that like we don't fit into that norm. We need to do things in a different way. So it does take really proactive personal work to sort of disrupt these systems as well, and it isn't easy.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, John. Thank you for making it. I've got about 5 more questions, but we haven't got time. So I'm going to ask one more question, which is around what are the panel's thoughts on this point? So I'm a fundraiser by profession, so I've got a real, it irks me talking about the diversity of the people who sit on boards of grant-making trusts and foundations, and so I'm really interested in that level of power, where funding goes to, where it doesn't go to, and how trustees of grant-making trusts and foundations use that power. I've checked with the Association of Charitable Foundations, ACF, and as I suspected, there is no data that they hold on LGBTQIA plus representation on those boards. What are the panel's thoughts on this? Do you have any thoughts on this question?
I don't mind having a go, because I've worked in a funder
go for it.
Years. So so I sort of think two things. I've got 2 thoughts about this. The first is that in my experience as someone that has worked with a lot of funders and worked inside a funder, funding boards are amongst the most conservative, small c, conservative, in boards that I've worked with, those sorts of things. Again, doesn't mean they're bad people and they don't do great work and that they're not incredibly creative. So I think there is definitely a good reason to point at funders and say what is happening in terms of both the diversity in terms of representation and the nature of the culture and how that influences your decision making. I think the flip side of that is I have noticed funder boards, perhaps more than any other, really grasping the nettle recently. So if you think about the number of charitable foundations that are stepping forward and are talking about spend out, or talking about really radically changing their boards. So I'm thinking, for instance, of Tudor at the minute are going through a process of just quite radical board change, and that is both led by the board and involves most of the board getting rid of themselves and stuff like that, because they want to embrace change around diversity of representation and difference. So I think that's my thought. I think there is a reason to point at that area, because they have so much power and influence, and they have traditionally been the kind of area that is like most likely to be composed of the most privileged people for all sorts of reasons, in my view. But it's also where some of the most radical actions happening, which I think we should also really embrace and encourage and sort of celebrate.
Agreed. Thank you. We don't actually have time for any further comments on this question. Sorry, guys. Sorry, folks. Penny, I know I need to hand over to you, but it just leaves me to say I think this week's been really illuminating. It's reinforced that there is a long way to go in terms of inclusion for LGBTQIA plus communities. I've seen a lot of language this week that has been inappropriate. I've seen people who have othered queer people. Yeah, it's been an interesting week. There's still a lot more to do. Thanks for the panel, for your openness, for your thoughts, for bringing your lived experience to the table. It's been absolutely brilliant to hear all of your perspectives. Penny, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity, and I'm going to hand over to you and stop talking.
Thank you so much, Kevin, Aaron, Amsel, John and Nancy, for a really powerful conversation. So thank you all for coming. I've posted...
You just muted yourself, Penny.
Sorry about that. Yes, please fill in our evaluation form. I've got trigger fingers today. We've got 2 more events left today. So 5 o'clock, we've got Where Are All the Working Class Trustees? That is £5 free if you're a weekly pass holder. You can also bag a free ticket if you identify as working class. And then we've got our final event at 6:30 tonight, which is Imposters on Boards, Overcoming Imposter Syndrome. That has had the largest amount of bookings, the second largest number of bookings from the 23 events this week, which probably tells us all we need to know. So thank you all so much, and hope to see you at a festival session this afternoon.